So tell us what we should know about Out with Lanterns and the scene that you're going to read for us.
Okay, so it is set in 1918. It's in sort of Somerset area of England, and broadly is the story of Ophelia, who is from a landed gentry family who decides to enlist in the Women's Land Army, which was formed towards the end of the First World War in the UK. And this chapter comes when she's been on her farm assignment for about a year. And Silas Larke, who was her father's tenant farmer, arrives as part of the sort of being seconded as a recovering soldier from the front. So this is when they have their surprise meeting. The other characters that are in this scene are the women who are also billeted on the farm. So Mrs. Darling is the woman who owns the farm, and then Hannah and Bess are two other recruits that are working there. So that's everybody that you'll meet in this scene.
Awesome. Well, take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay. In the beginning, it had been harder than she had expected. Doubt assailed her all the time, and the physical exhaustion made it even more difficult to feel like she was capable of what she had started. Her arms ached after only minutes of holding the reins or the plow, and her legs felt like leaden weights after 2 lengths of the smallest field on the farm. On the days when she could take a hot bath, Mrs. Darling passed Ophelia little cheesecloth pouches filled with lavender and peppermint to soothe her aching muscles, saying, "You'll get stronger soon enough, then we'll make a real farmer of you." Wringing out the cloth and laying it over the edge of the horse trough to dry, she turned her hands over, examining their fronts and backs. They were tanned, with a line of dirt under each nail, palms covered with overlapping layers of fresh and healing blisters. Having read any number of requests for advice on keeping one's hands nice in The Landswoman, the magazine for WLA members, she knew she was not the only woman surprised and sometimes dismayed by the changes their war work had wrought in their bodies. Something about knowing that there were women all over the country slathering tallow and homemade concoctions on their hands or sharing recipes for sore muscle salves made her feel connected to a network of women in a way nothing else ever had. Hannah and Bess, having both worked from a very young age, considered her entertainingly spoiled, but were also generous with their own advice. Hannah swore by rosewater for keeping one's complexion clear and showed Ophelia how to gather the rose petals from the wild roses along the lane, boil them, and decant the liquid into tiny bottles she had saved. Using it each morning, Ophelia found it even more luxurious than any of the toiletries she had been able to easily afford while living on the estate. Closing the door to Delilah's stall, she tidied the bridles on the wall before making her way to the house. She could murder a cup of tea and wondered hopefully if there might be leftover ham for a sandwich. Ducking to unlace her boots, she noticed a strange pair by the door, suddenly noting the rumble of a man's voice under the familiar tones of Hannah and Bess. Something about it raised the hairs on her arms. Taking a breath to steady the skitter of her heart, she brushed the worst of the dirt from her coat and breeches before stepping into the cool half-light of the kitchen passage. "There you are, girl," called Mrs. Darling from beside the sink, where she reached for a plate from the drying rack. "Sandwich and a cuppa for you." "Yes, please," Ophelia replied, emerging from the hallway to take in the scene before her. Bess and Hannah sat in their usual places, but there was a strange stiffness to their posture, which Ophelia immediately understood when she noticed the man sitting with his back to her. He was tall, his shoulders rising above the chair. Warm golden hair, a little long, curled almost to his shirt collar, and Ophelia could see that he sat with one hand on the table, one resting on a muscular thigh. His dark worsted work trousers were worn but clean and rode up slightly, revealing not only the length of his legs, but angry red scars in the space between his trouser leg and his sock. She glanced across at Hannah and Bess, who said nothing but watched her face intently. This must be the soldier, the one sent by the war ag. And then he turned, the graceful movement of muscle under linen momentarily catching her attention so that she didn't immediately register his face. The strangled noise he made distracted her from Mrs. Darling, who handed her a plate of bread and cheese, which fell unnoticed to the floor, smashing loudly. Ophelia's heart stuttered in her chest, her mouth open in a small slack O. How long had it been since she had seen him? It felt like yesterday. It felt like a decade. She tried to remember the disappointment of his leaving, but all she felt was a ridiculous surge of joy. She remembered every single detail of his face, the gray-green eyes, the sweep of dark lashes and brows, at this moment pulled tightly together above the line of his patrician nose. His mouth worked silently for a moment. Fee? Hannah's eyebrows shot up, eyes darting between Ophelia and Silas, cataloging every flinch and pause. Bess stared at Silas, blinking slowly. Ophelia tried to marshal her reeling thoughts. It's it's been a long time, Silas, she said, her hands moving restlessly against her jacket. She struggled to master her breathing, focusing on the clouds moving out the kitchen window, down from the hills, softening the bright summer sun that lay thick on the deep stone sill. Sit down, girl, Mrs. Darling said tartly. I'll make you another plate. Ophelia sat woodenly across from Silas, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Her chest felt tight and the back of her neck hot. She pushed ineffectually at the strands of hair that had escaped her kerchief and wondered if it were possible that Silas could hear her heart racing from his seat. Mrs. Darling turned from the table, picking up the broken crockery on her way, then lifted the kettle from the stove and poured a long stream into the waiting pot, saying, Well, as you seem to know each other, I'll not bother with introductions. Tea then, Mr. Larke. She plunked the cup and saucer down in front of him and reached around Ophelia to place the small creamer and sugar bowl within his reach. And how are you two acquainted? She asked, as she arranged a thick slice of bread and a hunk of cheese on a new plate, placing it in front of Ophelia. We, yes, they both began at once, tripping over each other's words. Silas dipped his chin slightly, indicating Ophelia should continue. Her eyes met his, and she felt the corner of her mouth lift in a smile. Mr. Larke and I knew each other when we were younger, Mrs. Darling. His eyes flicked to hers at her use of his full name. It feels like years since we saw each other last, Silas said. A lifetime, she thought. I suppose it has been. Hannah and Bess were practically vibrating in their seats, and Ophelia could tell it was taking every ounce of Bess's discipline not to blurt out a million questions about the situation unfolding before her. Hannah, on the other hand, had the pensive, withdrawn look that Ophelia had come to know meant she was examining something from all sides, assessing the information in front of her. Mr. Larke's family have been tenants on my family's estate for many years, long before either he or I were born, she said by way of explanation. But it was really only by happenstance that we met the summer after the war began. What kind of happenstance? Bess asked eagerly. Nothing so exciting as you might be hoping, Ophelia said with a laugh. She looked to Silas for confirmation and caught a flicker of emotion. A misdirected package, a book, he supplied, and Ophelia wondered if she detected a note of wistfulness in his voice. Bess nodded, and Hannah's face took a note of interest. Hopefully some salacious pamphlet or a truly morbid Gothic romance, she said with a smirk. Silas laughed, and Ophelia felt the sound spread through her like honey. She had forgotten how lovely and warm his laugh was. Are you familiar with R.L. Hill's Animal Husbandry, Volume 8? Hannah rolled her eyes, and Bess cackled. Mrs. Darling, her mouth crooked in a half smile, nodded and said, I've always found that one particularly useful, badgers and whatnot. Despite the laughter around the table, Ophelia was suddenly conscious of how little she had thought of Silas or the estate since she had left. It was as though the train ride had deposited her in an entirely different realm, and she had been so busy learning and working that she didn't have the energy or the inclination to give her past much thought. She had been glad to push her father as far from her mind as possible, had been resolute in focusing on the reason she had joined the WLA, so that she might learn how to navigate a life on her own, out from under the influence of men. While Silas explained the rest of the story to the other women, Ophelia took a long sip of her tea, bumping the cup against the rim of the saucer as she set it down. She felt unaccountably nervous, the arrival of a piece of her past life highlighting how changed she felt. She wondered if she appeared immediately different to Silas. She stole a glance and found him regarding her, a puzzled expression in his eyes. Another thing she had forgotten, what it felt like to have the full weight of his gaze on her, the gentle intensity of his looking. He swallowed, and she watched the column of his throat working and was startled to find herself hungry for every detail of him. She found that he didn't look exactly the same as she had first thought. There were subtle but marked changes everywhere. His hair was the same honey gold that she remembered, a little longer, but his cheekbones cut sharper, his lips a little more stern, set in a firm, flat line. It was his eyes that she noticed most, still the same mossy color, but flattened somehow, the mischievous twinkle missing. New fine lines emanated from the corners of his eyes, giving his face a quiet, tired air. His hands on the table were calloused, the knuckles marked by healed scars faded to silver, while a livid red line wound along the inside of his wrist up into his sleeve. She couldn't remember if he had been quite so broad and muscular, the hard balls of his shoulders snug against the fabric of his linen shirt, his heavy thighs clad in worn work trousers. An urge to reach out and touch him flooded Ophelia's fingers. It was a feeling she had experienced often during their summer of friendship. He was beautiful and kind and thoughtful, all things she hadn't ever expected in any man. The sudden awareness that summer of how lonely her life had been before Silas only made his friendship dearer, and she had mourned him keenly when he had enlisted. He had informed her of his enlistment in a short note, and she had felt no invitation to write to him in those few lines. She pushed down the squirming giddiness of once again being in Silas's company and forced herself to focus on what she had come here to do, remake herself, independent, alone.